The intergalactic station hummed with the weight of 1,000 worlds, its corridors gleaming like polished bone beneath artificial stars. In the lowest kitchen, where no dignitary would ever think to look, a human chef kneaded dough with hands that remembered Earth, while his daughter slept in quarters too small for dreaming. But when the Empress of Veloria arrived with her child and called his craft flat garbage, she set in motion something that would shake the foundations of galactic pride. Because what Drew Mills was about to do with flour and fire would prove that magic doesn't need a crown. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The station's underbelly breathed with the rhythm of forgotten machinery, pipes hissing steam that tasted of recycled water and distant suns. Level 9 kitchens sat 3 floors below the diplomatic suites, where the ceilings pressed low and the air carried the weight of 1,000 meals cooked for mouths that would never know the cook's name. Drew Mills stood at the steel counter, his white chef's coat worn soft at the elbows, flour dusting his forearms like snow that would never melt. His hands moved through dough with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing only ruins what matters. The kitchen served the station's lower staff, maintenance workers and cargo handlers, who ate quickly between shifts, their conversations clipped and functional. Drew didn't mind the anonymity. Anonymity meant safety for a single father raising a daughter in the margins of galactic society, where humans ranked somewhere between useful and tolerated. His daughter Maya, just 7 years old, slept in the quarters adjacent to the kitchen, a room barely large enough for a cot, and her collection of salvaged star charts. She dreamed of planets while he shaped bread that would fill bellies but never earn praise. The dough beneath his palms was simple: flour and water and yeast that rose despite the station's artificial gravity. Drew had learned to coax life from humble ingredients, the way his grandfather had in a Brooklyn pizzeria decades before the wars, before the treaties, before humans became the galaxy's laborers. The recipe lived in his muscle memory, passed down through hands that believed bread was more than sustenance. It was communion, patience, made edible, time given form. Above him, the ventilation system rattled with the footsteps of dignitaries preparing for tomorrow's summit. Empresses and warlords, philosophers and trade barons, all gathering to reshape treaties that would never touch the lives of those who cleaned their halls or cooked their food. Drew listened to the distant thunder of power and felt nothing but relief at his distance from it. He had seen what happened to humans who caught the attention of the galactic elite. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant judgment, and judgment for his kind rarely ended well. He stretched the dough thin, checking for tears in the gluten web, then set it aside to rest. The kitchen timer hummed, counting down minutes that belonged only to him and the bread. Outside the narrow window, stars blurred past in streams of light, entire civilizations reduced to streaks. Drew wiped his hands on his apron and didn't notice the shadow passing overhead, the Imperial cruiser docking 3 levels above, carrying a passenger who would soon change everything he thought he knew about staying invisible. The summons arrived at dawn, delivered by a Crovasian attendant whose crystalline skin refracted the hallway lights into fractured rainbows. Drew stood in the doorway of his quarters, Maya still asleep behind him, and read the message twice before understanding settled like cold water in his chest. The Empress of Veloria requested a private chef for her daughter's meals during the summit. A human chef, specifically. The words carried no explanation, only coordinates, and a time that left him 30 minutes to report. Maya stirred as he moved through the small room, gathering his knives and checking his coat for stains. She sat up, her dark hair wild from sleep, eyes already filling with the worry she had learned too young. "You have to go?" Her voice was small, the question of a child who had watched her father leave for shifts that sometimes stretched into days. "Just upstairs," Drew said, kneeling beside her cot. "The diplomatic kitchens. I'll be back before lunch." He didn't mention the Empress, didn't speak the fear coiling beneath his ribs. Maya had heard enough stories about what happened when humans disappointed alien royalty. She pressed her forehead against his, their ritual, and whispered the words his wife had once said before every separation. "Come back whole." The diplomatic level gleamed with a sterility that made Drew's kitchen feel warm by comparison. Here, every surface reflected power, walls embedded with screens displaying star systems owned by those who walked these halls. Guards stood at intervals, their armor humming with energy fields that could disintegrate flesh before a threat fully formed. Drew kept his eyes down, his knife roll clutched against his chest, and followed the coordinates to a kitchen 3 times the size of his own. It was empty, waiting. Ingredients lined the counters in labeled containers, each one worth more than a month of his salary. Fruits from worlds he had only seen in Maya's star charts, grains harvested under triple suns, proteins from creatures that swam in methane seas. A small figure stood at the window, backlit by the station's artificial dawn. Princess Zyla, daughter of Empress of Veloria, no taller than Maya but carrying herself with the rigid posture of someone taught that slouching was failure. She turned, her skin a pale violet that shifted to lavender in the light, her eyes too large and too knowing for a child. "You're the human cook." Not a question, a classification. Drew nodded, setting his knife roll on the counter with careful respect. "Yes, Your Highness. I'm here to prepare your meals." Zyla's nose ridges flared, a gesture Drew had learned meant disgust among her species. "My mother says humans make primitive food. She says you'll teach me what not to become." The words landed without malice, simply facts delivered by a child repeating lessons learned. Drew felt something old and tired shift inside him, the weight of being measured and found wanting before he'd even begun. But he had Maya to feed, quarters to keep, and pride was a luxury he'd surrendered long ago. "What would you like to eat?" he asked. Zyla circled the kitchen like a surveyor assessing condemned property, her small hands clasped behind her back in unconscious mimicry of imperial authority. She paused at each ingredient station, examining labels with the careful scrutiny of someone taught that everything contained either value or threat. Drew waited, his hands resting on the counter, feeling the familiar texture of steel beneath his palms. He had fed dignitaries before, cargo masters and security chiefs who treated him with the casual dismissal reserved for furniture, but never royalty. Never a child who looked at him like he was a specimen under glass. "My mother attended a human cultural exhibition once," Zyla said, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of a memorized story. "They served something called pizza, flat bread with red paste and melted fat. She said it looked like garbage someone had stepped on and tried to salvage." The princess turned, her large eyes reflecting Drew's stillness. "Is that what you make? Flat garbage?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire not yet contained. Drew felt heat rise along his neck. Not anger exactly, but something older and more dangerous. Pride, perhaps, or the ghost of his grandfather's voice reminding him that bread was sacred, that what you made with your hands carried your name even when no one knew to speak it. He thought of Maya, of the pizzas they made together on his rare days off, her small fingers stretching dough while he told her stories about Brooklyn and ovens that had fed neighborhoods through wars and winters. "Pizza is Neapolitan," Drew said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor wanting to surface. "It's bread and tomatoes and cheese, but it's also geometry and chemistry and time. The dough needs exactly the right hydration. The oven needs to breathe at precisely 625 degrees. And the crust needs to blister in 90 seconds or it loses its soul." He met Zyla's eyes, seeing curiosity flicker beneath the rehearsed disdain. "Your mother saw fast food, something mass-produced for crowds. That's not pizza. That's an insult wearing its name." Zyla's head tilted, the gesture bird-like and unnervingly sharp. "You're saying the Empress is wrong." It wasn't quite a question, more an observation of something unprecedented, a rule violation she hadn't known was possible. Drew felt the weight of what he'd just done settle across his shoulders. Contradicting royalty, even politely, even technically, was the kind of mistake that ended careers, or worse, that made you disappear into the station's lower levels, where humans went when they became problems. "I'm saying she didn't taste real pizza," Drew said, and the distinction felt thinner than the dough he'd stretched that morning. Zyla stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then walked to the door and pressed the communication panel. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never been denied. "Mother," the human says, "you're wrong about flat garbage. I want to see if he's lying." The Empress arrived like weather, preceded by a pressure change that made the kitchen's atmosphere feel suddenly thin. Drew heard her before he saw her, the whisper of robes that cost more than his lifetime earnings, the synchronized footsteps of guards whose weapons hummed at frequencies designed to remind flesh of its fragility. He stood at the counter, hands resting in plain sight, and felt his heart beat against his ribs like something caged and aware of its captivity. Empress Veloria filled the doorway despite being barely taller than Drew himself. Her skin gleamed emerald in the kitchen's harsh light, her crown a living thing of crystal and bioluminescent flora that pulsed with her mood. Currently, it flickered amber, which Drew's brief orientation had taught him meant displeasure. Her eyes, black as collapsed stars, fixed on him with the weight of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any room. "You told my daughter I was wrong." Her voice carried harmonics that made the steel counters vibrate slightly, each word landing with the precision of a scalpel finding nerve. Zyla stood behind her mother, expression carefully, neutral. But Drew caught the smallest flicker of something in her eyes. Anticipation, perhaps, or the guilty thrill of a child who had lit a fuse and now waited for the explosion. Drew's throat felt dry, his hands steady only through years of practice keeping them so. He thought of Maya, of the promise he'd made to come back whole, and weighed his next words with the care of a man defusing ordnance. "I said you hadn't tasted real pizza, Your Majesty. There's a difference between wrong and incomplete information." The distinction felt impossibly thin, a semantic shield against imperial wrath. But it was all he had. Velara's crown pulsed deeper amber, edging toward red. She moved into the kitchen with the fluid grace of a predator, her guards flanking her like extensions of her will. "Humans," she said, and the word carried centuries of context, "have contributed labor to this galaxy. Maintenance, sanitation, food service. At its most basic, what you have not contributed is culture worth preserving or cuisine worth remembering." She stopped 3 paces from Drew, close enough that he could smell something like ozone and distant rain on her skin. "You are utilities. Useful, but replaceable." The words should have bent him, should have sent him into the apologies and deference that kept humans employed and breathing. But Drew thought of his grandfather's hands shaping dough in Brooklyn, of his wife before the accident teaching Maya to taste basil and recognize when garlic sang, of every pizza he'd made in the margins of this station for people who ate without seeing. He thought of the recipe living in his blood and bone, passed down through generations who had believed that feeding people was holy work. "Then let me prove you incomplete, Your Majesty," Drew said, his voice quiet but carrying. "Let me make you real pizza. If I'm wrong, I'll accept whatever judgment you see fit." Silence filled the kitchen like rising water, drowning even the hum of refrigeration units and the distant throb of the station's engines. Velara's crown blazed full crimson, a color Drew's orientation had explicitly warned meant imminent violence or irreversible decree. The guards shifted, their weapons charging with a sound like distant thunder rolling closer. Zyla's eyes widened, her small hands gripping the edge of her mother's robes as if to anchor herself against whatever storm was about to break. Drew felt his pulse in his fingertips, in his throat, in the spaces between his thoughts where survival instinct screamed at him to retract, apologize, grovel. But he had already stepped beyond the cliff's edge, already spoken the words that could not be unspoken. Retreat now would only confirm what Velara already believed, that humans were spineless creatures who postured until tested. At least falling forward meant falling with dignity intact. The Empress studied him with an intensity that felt surgical, as if she were peeling back his skin to examine what presumption looked like in its raw form. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something almost conversational, which somehow felt more dangerous than her earlier imperial thunder. You would stake your position, perhaps your freedom, on bread and cheese? The question carried genuine curiosity beneath its mockery, as if she were trying to understand a form of madness she had not previously encountered. I would stake it on craft, Drew said, and meant it. On the difference between assembly and art, between filling bellies and feeding souls. He gestured to the ingredients lining the counters, expensive and exotic and utterly wrong for what he needed. But I'll need different supplies. Flour from earth or similar grain, tomatoes grown under a yellow sun, milk from creatures that graze, not synthesize. Real mozzarella requires specific chemistry. Velara's laugh came sharp and short, like glass breaking. The human makes demands. She turned to Zyla, whose expression had shifted from anxiety to fascination. You see, daughter, this is what happens when lesser species forget their station. They develop delusions of importance. But even as she spoke, Drew noticed her crown fading from crimson to orange, the color his orientation had labeled as intrigued consideration. If you fail, Velara said, turning back to Drew with eyes that held no mercy, you will be removed from this station. Your daughter will be placed in institutional care, and your name will be flagged across every system as someone who challenged royal authority and proved himself worthless. She stepped closer, her presence filling his vision. If you somehow succeed in making this flat garbage palatable, I will grant you one boon of reasonable scope. Do you accept these terms? Drew thought of Maya sleeping in quarters too small for dreaming, of his grandfather's hands in flour, of his wife's voice saying that food made with love could cross any divide. He thought of every human who had bowed and scraped to survive, and every human who had stood upright and paid the cost. I accept, he said. The ingredients arrived within the hour. Procured through channels Drew suspected involved override codes and requisition forms that would raise questions later. A junior attendant, Skrell by species and terrified by disposition, wheeled in containers marked with Earth's obsolete agricultural codes. Drew recognized the labels from memory. From a childhood spent in his grandfather's pizzeria before the consolidation, before humans became cheap labor, scattered across stations that barely remembered their homeworld existed. He worked in silence while Velara watched from a seat she had commanded be brought, her posture regal even in observation. Zyla stood beside her mother, forbidden to approach but clearly captivated by the ritual unfolding before her. The guards remained posted at the exits, their weapons no longer charging but still present, still ready. Drew tried to ignore them all, tried to find the quiet place in his mind where only the dough mattered, where hands and flour spoke a language older than star travel. The flour felt right, proper protein content, slightly coarse against his palms. He measured by touch and instinct, adding water in careful increments, watching the mixture transform from shaggy mess to coherent mass. His grandfather had never used scales, had taught Drew that baking was conversation between cook and ingredient, a dialogue conducted through fingertips and patience. Too much water, and the dough would slump, lifeless. Too little, and it would fight every stretch, refusing to become what it was meant to be. Salt, just enough to awaken flavor, sleeping in the grain. Yeast, bloomed in warm water with a pinch of sugar to feed its hunger. Drew folded and pressed, feeling the gluten strands align and strengthen, building structure that would trap air and create the honeycomb crumb that made bread transcendent rather than merely edible. His shoulders settled into the rhythm, his breathing synchronized with the kneading, and for a moment he forgot the Empress watching, forgot the stakes, forgot everything except the ancient alchemy happening beneath his hands. How long does this take? Zyla's voice broke the silence, young and impatient and unexpectedly vulnerable. Drew glanced up, saw genuine curiosity on her face, rather than the rehearsed disdain she had worn earlier. Velara's expression remained unreadable, but her crown had faded to yellow, a color Drew's orientation had said meant neutral observation. The dough needs to rest, Drew said, shaping the mass into a smooth ball. 18 to 24 hours, ideally. The yeast needs time to work, to create flavor and texture. Good pizza can't be rushed. He placed the dough in an oiled container, covered it with cloth that smelled faintly of earth cotton. But we can make a version in 4 hours if we adjust the temperature and hydration. Veloria leaned forward, slightly, a gesture so small Drew almost missed it. You would serve me rushed work? Inferior product? The words carried challenge, but also something else. A test within the test. Drew met her eyes. I would serve you the best pizza 4 hours allows. Or you can wait, and I'll serve you perfection. Veloria chose to wait, a decision that rippled through the diplomatic level, like a stone dropped in still water. The Empress of Veloria, whose schedule was planned in increments measured by atomic decay, had cleared an entire day to watch a human make bread. Attendants whispered in corridors, guards exchanged glances that carried questions they would never voice, and Zyla settled onto the floor near the counter with the patience of a child granted unexpected reprieve from formal duties. Drew worked through the hours with quiet focus, checking the dough's progress, feeling for the subtle expansion that meant yeast was converting sugar into carbon dioxide and flavor. He prepared the other elements while waiting, crushing tomatoes by hand until they became sauce that smelled like summer in a world he barely remembered, pulling mozzarella curds through hot water until they achieved the glossy elasticity that would melt into creamy pools. Each task carried its own meditation, its own requirement for attention that bordered on reverence. The kitchen's chronometer marked 18 hours when Drew finally uncovered the dough. It had doubled, its surface taut and alive with fermentation, and when he pressed a finger into its flesh, the indentation slowly filled, proving the gluten had developed properly. He divided the mass into portions, shaped each into a ball with the heel of his hand, and let them rest again while he fired the oven to temperatures that made the air shimmer and dance. Zyla had returned after sleeping. Her hair arranged differently. Her robes changed, but her expression unchanged. Still curious, still watching. Veloria had remained throughout the night, dismissing attendants who came with messages, ignoring the summons that flashed on her personal comm. She watched Drew with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation that refused to balance, and her crown had settled into a steady green that Drew's orientation had labeled as deeply contemplative. When the oven reached temperature, Drew took the first ball of dough and began to stretch. His hands moved with the confidence of muscle memory, fingers pressing from center outward, creating a disc that grew wider with each rotation. He lifted the dough, let gravity assist, caught it, and turned it, building a rhythm that was half technique and half performance. The dough became a circle, then a wider circle, edges thin enough to see light through, center slightly thicker to support what would come. Then, because something in Veloria's watching eyes demanded his absolute best, Drew tossed the dough. It rose, spinning, catching light like a pale moon rotating in miniature. The rotation stretched it further, evening the thickness, creating the perfect canvas. He caught it on his knuckles, tossed again, higher this time, and the dough spun with a grace that seemed to defy the station's artificial gravity. Time suspended, the kitchen holding its breath, and even Veloria's crown flickered to a color Drew had not seen before, something between blue and violet that his orientation had never mentioned. The dough landed perfectly centered on his waiting hands. Drew worked quickly now, the dough's temperature rising, its structure fragile and temporary. He laid the stretched circle on the wooden peel dusted with semolina that would let it slide into the oven's throat. Sauce first, spread in spirals from center outward, leaving a border for the crust to bloom. Not too much, his grandfather's voice echoed in memory. Let the bread breathe. Then mozzarella, torn by hand into irregular pieces that would melt into landscapes of cream and brown. Fresh basil, leaves bruised, slightly to release their oils, scattered like green prayers across the white. A drizzle of olive oil that caught the light. Salt, just a whisper. Drew slid the peel under the pizza, tested its movement, ensured nothing had stuck, then approached the oven, whose heat pressed against his face like a physical force. One smooth motion, a practiced slide, and the pizza landed on the oven's stone floor, where flames licked at its edges with hungry tongues. 90 seconds. That was all the time between raw and ruined, between perfect and merely acceptable. Drew watched through the oven's window as the crust began to blister, as bubbles rose and charred in leopard spots that marked proper fermentation and ideal heat. The cheese melted, its edges browning, its center staying creamy. The sauce darkened slightly, concentrating its sweetness. The basil wilted, releasing perfume that filled the kitchen with the scent of summer gardens on a planet most aliens had never seen. At 87 seconds, Drew pulled the pizza free. The crust had risen tall and light, its underside marked with the char that proved the oven's floor had been hot enough. He slid it onto a wooden board, let it rest for 30 seconds while the cheese set slightly, then cut it with a blade that had been his grandfather's, brought across stars in luggage that weighed more sentiment than sense. He placed a slice on a simple ceramic plate and set it before Veloria. No garnish, no ceremony, just pizza as it was meant to be, honest and whole. The Empress stared at it as if it might contain a trap, her crown cycling through colors too quickly for Drew to track. Zyla leaned forward, her nose ridges flaring as she inhaled the steam rising from the slice. Veloria lifted the pizza with both hands, the traditional way, supporting the crust. She examined the cross-section, the honeycomb structure of the bread, the layers of cheese and sauce. Then, with the deliberation of someone performing a test that could not be repeated, she bit. Her eyes closed. The kitchen fell silent except for the oven's crackling breath. Drew watched her chew, swallow, watched emotions cross her face too quickly to name, watched her crown blaze through a spectrum that ended in a color like dawn breaking over water. She set the slice down carefully, looked at Drew with eyes that held something he had never seen directed at a human before. Not contempt, not dismissal, recognition. Veloria did not speak immediately. She stared at the remaining pizza on the board, at the slice she had bitten, at Drew, who stood with flour still dusting his forearms and waiting written into his posture. The silence stretched until it became its own language, until even Zyla seemed afraid to breathe. The guards had stopped their subtle fidgeting, frozen in the presence of something unprecedented, their empress rendered speechless by bread and cheese. When Veloria finally moved, it was to take another bite. Then another. She ate the entire slice, with the focused attention of someone studying a text that contradicted everything she had been taught. Zyla watched her mother with wide eyes, then looked at Drew with an expression that mixed awe and accusation, as if he had performed a magic trick that violated the rules of a game she thought she understood. "Mother?" Zyla's voice came small and uncertain. Veloria set the crust down, having eaten everything except the final curved edge that purists left behind. Her crown had settled into a deep blue that Drew's orientation had never covered, a color that seemed to pulse with something like sorrow, or perhaps shame. "I was wrong," Veloria said, and the words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. "Not incomplete. Wrong." She stood, her robes whispering, and approached Drew until they stood separated by less than an arm's length. "What I tasted at the exhibition was an insult to this. It was to actual pizza what a surveillance recording is to witnessing a sunrise. Similar components, entirely different truth." Drew felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had carried so long he had forgotten its weight. "Your Majesty, I—" But Veloria raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that carried no malice, only the need to finish speaking something difficult. "Do you know what we teach our children about humans?" She glanced at Zyla, who had risen and now stood clutching the edge of the counter. "We teach them that you are serviceable, but not sophisticated, that you contribute labor but not art, that your cultures dissolved under the weight of galactic integration because they held nothing worth preserving." Her crown pulsed darker. "We teach them to pity you, which is just cruelty wearing kindness as a mask." She turned back to the pizza, to the remaining slices cooling on their board. But this required knowledge passed through generations. It required understanding of chemistry and physics and timing. It required patience and practice, and the kind of pride that refuses to cut corners even when no one is watching. Velara looked at Drew with eyes that held something fragile. It required culture. The exact thing we claimed you lacked. Zyla moved then, approaching the board with hesitant steps. She looked at her mother, received a nod, and lifted a slice with both hands the way Velara had. She bit, her expression shifting from dutiful attempt to genuine surprise to something approaching wonder. The changes began quietly, the way dawn arrives in increments too subtle to mark until suddenly the darkness has fled. Velara issued her first decree before leaving the kitchen, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had decided that being wrong publicly was less shameful than remaining wrong privately. The station's commissary would expand to include human cultural foods, prepared by human chefs, offered alongside the delicacies of 100 other worlds, not hidden in lower levels, but displayed with equal prominence, equal respect. Drew returned to his quarters that evening to find Maya awake and waiting, her face pressed to the small window that overlooked the docking bays. She turned when he entered, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks, though her expression held no sadness. "Everyone's talking about you," she whispered. "They're saying you made an empress cry." Drew knelt beside her, pulled her close, and felt the trembling in her small frame. "Not cry, sweetheart. Just think differently." Within a week, the diplomatic level's main gallery featured a new installation, a recreation of a traditional pizzeria complete with a wood-fired oven shipped at ruinous expense from Earth. Drew was offered the position of master chef, a title that came with quarters large enough for Maya to have her own room, with windows that showed stars instead of hallways. He accepted on one condition, that he could train others, human and alien both, in the craft his grandfather had carried across oceans and he had carried across stars. Zyla became his first student. She arrived each morning with her crown carefully stored, her hands scrubbed clean, and a hunger to learn that had nothing to do with obligation. Velara watched from the gallery sometimes, her presence no longer oppressive but contemplative, and occasionally she would ask questions about fermentation or gluten development with the careful precision of someone rebuilding an understanding from flawed foundations. Other dignitaries came, drawn by curiosity or rumor, or the simple fact that an empress had proclaimed something valuable. They tasted pizza made by human hands and found in it something they had not expected. Proof that sophistication was not the exclusive province of those who had conquered stars first. Some left unchanged, their prejudices too calcified to crack. Others returned, bringing colleagues, bringing questions, bringing the tentative respect of those willing to admit their own ignorance. Drew taught Maya to toss dough on a quiet Sunday, the gallery empty, just father and daughter, and flour in the air like snow. She laughed when her first attempt landed crooked, tried again with the determination she had inherited from a mother who had believed humans deserved space at every table. The dough spun, imperfect but rising, and Drew saw in her hands the continuation of something that had survived wars and treaties and the long humiliation of being deemed useful but not essential. In time, the pizzeria became a pilgrimage site, not for worship but for the rarer act of reconsidering what had been dismissed. And every pizza that emerged from its oven carried the same quiet message his grandfather had kneaded into dough generations before. That craft is culture, that patience is power, and that magic does not need a crown when it has hands willing to work and a heart that refuses to forget what matters.